welcome to our new economy shortcuts, the second one this year. And we are very proud to have a very high-level speaker, and Angus Deaton has accepted to join us and to give a speech, a talk on his book, his recent book, and Christoph Schmidt to comment on this. I don't want to talk any longer because we have an excellent moderator, Heike Buchter from Die Zeit, and I will immediately hand over to you and come back later in the discussion. Thank you.
So I hope that everyone can hear me clearly. I'm also very pleased to be able to lead this discussion today, which is basically about a topic that a lot of people are more or less waking up to a new or not so new reality. Like famous Yogi Berra once said, it's déjà vu all over again. And I also wanted to say that I'm really, well, maybe that's a little criticism about the title of the book, Economics in America. I was delighted to see how readable and funny it was, even if Economics in America is, not really funny in the least. And so, I wanted to I wanted to hand this over to Angus and talk a little bit about why actually he felt like writing a book not on economics but about economists, and how did that come about?
I think, the introduction explains that over the last 25 years, I've been writing semi-annual letters to the Royal Economic Society, trying to explain to British and British economists what a weird place America was. And one of the original titles was Shock and Awe, meaning that I was very in awe of the amazing things I saw here, but also shocked by some of the awful things. And then by the end, when I was trying to put it together in the book, getting rid of some of the not so good pieces and writing new ones, I realized that this topic about the extent to which economists had been responsible for the mess we were in sort of very much came to the fore. So that's the story of the book. So it's partly biographical, partly a memoir, and partly I'm trying to let ordinary people know what economists are like, that occasionally we're human, we're probably not as boring as accountants, or perhaps we're more boring, but it was sort of trying to tell some of the story.
It was interesting and eye-opening in the sense that if you read interviews with economists or studies or papers by economists, you would never guess how tough it is to be an economist among economists. This is kind of, no barrels told environment that you're in. I was a little shocked. I thought that journalists were the only ones kind of having this kind of life underneath the kind of headlines, so to speak. So was that something that was surprising to you? I felt like when I read the book that you were surprised a little bit about this type of environment that you were getting into.
I don't know. It's certainly very competitive, and I don't know to what extent that's just happened to be where I was, and that other places are nicer. I'm not entirely sure that's true. But there's a lot of collaboration too, as well as a lot of competition. So I don't think we're probably that much more competitive. But we're also open, which is a very good thing. You can be a tenured professor at Harvard when you're 25 years old, which is not true in a lot of other professions. So maybe some of that competition, is good, that it's open.
Mm-hmm. Even if it sounds a little vitriolic at times. So, we wanted to hear from you what you had prepared for today's event.
All right. I have some slides, and let me use those, and then I'll cut back when I'm done. If I can find the slides, I had them there before. Here we are. Okay, can you see those all right?
Yep.
Slideshow, start, play from start. So this is the cover of the book, this very clever bow tie that my publishers thought up, which of course doesn't really exist, though I have one that looks like it. So here's the topic that you advertised, which is, are economists to blame? And many people, not just in America, but around the world, seem to have lost faith in capitalism, as well as any faith or trust they ever had in economists who are seen as apologists or apologists for capitalism. And so the question is, did economics take a wrong turn? Did we, that's include myself among those, get important things wrong? Or is there something wrong with economics, or is it just a version that we're currently using? I want to make it very clear, this is not one of these attack books, which says I was right and everybody else was wrong. It's very much a question of I was wrong, we were wrong, and I'm trying to change my mind and rethink a lot of things I've believed for a long time. And this part of the book has stirred up quite a fuss. Larry Summers, for one, got very upset. And we had a debate on YouTube, which if you really want to be depressed, you might want to watch it. A lot of people have watched it, and I'm very happy about that, but it was not a particularly pleasant occasion. Many people claim he bears some responsibility for the Asian financial crisis and the global financial crisis and other similar events. But if that's true, all of us were similarly responsible because we were cheering Larry on, and Larry, in some sense, is a figurehead, someone who's probably the smartest economist I know and had the opportunity to really affect events in a way that many of us would probably have done so the same had we been in charge. So one of those things I start with in the book is Alan Kruger and David Card's work on the minimum wage, which was going on when I first came to Princeton. And as many people will know, New Jersey increased its minimum wage in April 1992, and Pennsylvania did not, which was next door. They knew this would happen in advance, and they had the very unusual idea of collecting data on employment in fast food places in both states before and after the change. This is an example of what has come to be known as design-based econometrics. So economics textbooks right across the spectrum, right-wing ones, left-wing ones, all the rest of it, said that employment should fall in New Jersey relative to Pennsylvania because the wage had gone up in New Jersey, minimum wage, and not in Pennsylvania. And it didn't, is what they discovered. If anything, the reverse, employment rose in New Jersey relative to Pennsylvania, essentially because employment fell in Pennsylvania. Now, this, of course, was a challenge to conventional wisdom. In Jason Furman's wonderful term, it's persuaded about half the profession, even today. And there were storms of criticism. One Nobel laureate called them camp-following whores. And there were a lot of other very similar insults that were bandied around. The American Economic Association was accused of being a communist front organization for publishing this work. But as in the book they wrote afterwards, there's a perfectly good story for why this might happen, which is it will happen when employers have some monopsony power. There's not perfectly competitive local labor market, so they're actually making profits out of workers. And when the wages go up, they don't fire them. They just make a little less profit, and you get a sort of class struggle in some sense between capital and labor. this is not in the book, but I wanted to make the point because I think it's very important. The increasing minimum wage is an example of what's called pre-distribution, which is sort of interfering in the market, interfering with prices in the market, rather than just redistributing after the market has had its way. And it's not at all supported by free market economics. And it's not even supported by second-best economics like Merle's, Diamond, and so on, which would prefer distribution of income. And there's a wonderful story on Orley Ashenfelter's recent podcasts about labor economics, about Ray Marshall, who was Carter's Secretary of the Treasury, a very, very interesting guy. You can read this, hear this on the podcast, or look at the transcript. He grew up in an orphanage in Mississippi, went away to sea and was in the Navy for a while, finished up with a PhD in economics, and became Secretary of Labor in the Carter administration. And he had a big fight with the Treasury Secretary, who was Michael Blumenthal, a Princeton alum, and Charlie Schultz, who was at Brookings and was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisor. And Schultz has become the sort of epitome of economists who really believe in efficiency. And he believed in efficiency then, and he and Blumenthal were very, very against the minimum wage increase. Marshall, quote, says, Carter was right, he was also highly moral. You could win an argument with him if you use the moral argument. Blumenthal and Schultz opposed the minimum wage increase, and Marshall was in favor. They had to go to Carter to settle this, so they go to the White House. Blumenthal and Schultz present all the standard economic stuff, and then when Marshall is asked to speak, he says, I could disprove all of that in a minute, but I'm not going to, because this is not an economic argument. This is a moral argument. There are about 5 million people out there who won't get a raise unless we give it to them, and they don't have a lot of power. You know who they are. They're not well educated. And Carter was persuaded and said, let's increase the minimum wage, which was actually the last time it was done. And so when they were leaving the White House, Charlie Schultz said to Ray Marshall, that was dirty, meaning it was an underhand thing to have said. And no, Charlie, said Ray Marshall, your problem is that you're monolingual. You can only speak economics. Now, I'm bilingual. I can speak economics and Baptist. And that, to me, is just a great story. These ethical arguments in favor of redistribution have not much figured in mainstream economics. One of the other areas where I think economics is not getting things right is in trade. And as long as this is a revision of my own thought rather than an attack on someone else, the standard argument is that trade is an engine of prosperity, and freer trade, lowering tariffs, is always in the national interest. And along with that, and the globalization that there's been over the last 30 years, the large-scale poverty reduction around the world is held up as an extraordinary achievement that is unparalleled in human history. And between 1990 and 2019, 1.4 billion people exited from destitution-level poverty. That's the World Bank statistics. And the argument is, if some people in rich countries were hurt, who lost their jobs, they were much better off to start with than the global poor who were exiting poverty in India or China. And the argument is there are no people as poor as that in the United States, or indeed in Germany or anywhere in rich countries. And this is sort of utilitarianism, which is that people who have less should get priority, or what philosophers call cosmopolitan prioritarianism, in which you look at the whole world and you favor the people with the least, and you give less attention to people who have more, who are a lot of your working people in your own country. So the arguments against this, Danny Roderick has made these arguments for many years, and the standard economic argument is that lowering tariffs brings first-order gains and losses, but only second-order gains. So to economists, this is a question of what we would call rectangles and triangles. So there's a big effect on the people who lose and a big effect on the people who gain. And the difference between these two things, the gainers gain more than the losers lose, and therefore it's in the national interest. But what does the national interest mean? Because compensation to the losers rarely, if ever, gets paid. They say, okay, these people who had these jobs can move, but mobility is much lower and much harder than it used to be. what we call NIMBYism in successful cities. Going to a successful city is really hard because they're very expensive. It's also not just about money, and that's something that I worry about economics a lot. We measure well-being in money, whereas there's lots of else involved, which is communities and marriages, and I'm going to talk more about that later. Another really important effect is that unions in the US were weakened by trade. So if you're more open to trade, it's easier to do bad things to your own workers because you have an alternative which you didn't have before. The second but is that there is truly awful poverty in America. And if you read work by my colleagues, Matt Desmond, or by Kathy Eden, Taylor, and Schaefer, it's arguably as bad as in Africa, Asia, or Latin America, and especially if you don't just use money as the metric. So the disputes are not about the existence of that poverty in the US, but about its extent and about just how bad it is. And of course, I want to make it clear that I'm not challenging the legitimacy of a concern for global poverty. I've not changed my mind on that at all. But there's more buts. So this cosmopolitan approach makes no sense to me, either ethically or practically. On the ethical side, we have duties to our fellow citizens that we do not share with foreigners. Now, many philosophers say the nation state is a moral irrelevance. Why should we pay any attention to it? Well, it's not just a matter of liking them, though there are bonds of history and culture that often unite people in their own country, but of sharing tax and insurance schemes, as well as military, legal, and political systems that we all submit to. You know, the Indian poor do not have to serve in the US Army if they're called to do so. They do not have to pay US taxes. And the problem in some sense is that we, the deciders, are part of an educated elite that pays no price and may indeed benefit from trade and globalization. So it's very easy for us to say, don't worry about American poor because there are much poorer people in India and China. But that's somewhat of a self-serving argument. But I think the practical arguments are even stronger, which is fellow citizens vote in a way that Chinese and Indian workers don't. And so we need to be very careful, if only in our own self-interest. The populists are going to come for us with pitchforks. And that's where the Trump story comes in. And then as a final argument, you know, was the price we paid in America actually necessary? My friend Ashoka Modi has written a book about India recently. He makes it very clear that exports played very little part in the poverty reduction that's taken place in India. And there's been a lot of poverty reduction in India, but it didn't come through exports, even the famed back office jobs and so on. 75% of the 1.4 billion reduction in poverty were in those China and India. China, the biggest part. But if you look at China, which did export its way out of poverty, there's no doubt about that. China saves half of its GDP. Is about 51.1% in 2010. So imagine a world in which China had consumed a larger share of its income, like most countries do. Then perhaps it could have grown just as rapidly, but a higher share of production would be consumed at home rather than as abroad. So you could still have all this Chinese growth, this Chinese poverty reduction, but those goods would have been produced for the home market instead of being produced for the American market or the European market. And, you know, I'm not an expert on this sort of thing. And so I don't want to claim that this is true, but I want to claim that it's worth thinking about. Did we really have to have, did it have to work out the way it really worked out? So that cosmopolitan prioritarianism does not excuse what happens, though not completely so, though it offers some sort of partial justification, and perhaps it wasn't necessary anyway. That's the argument here. Now, the final set of results I do want to show you about are real empirical results, and this is the work that Ann Case and I have been doing on mortality in America in the last decade. And I'll show you some of the facts in a minute, But our interpretation of these facts is that they point to serious failings in American society, especially for the majority of people who are not highly educated, and to failings in policy, including economic policy. And you can see some of the reactions by economists to these critiques, which are discussed in the book. I'm not going to discuss here. So here's a picture of life expectancy. Let's move away from just consumption and think about something else that's very important to people, which is how long they live. And what this shows is life expectancy at birth in the US, which is the heavy black line, and 22 other rich countries, including mostly from Europe, but also Japan, Korea, Australia, Canada, so on. And what you can see is if you go back to 1980, the US was right in the middle of the pack. It wasn't particularly good and it wasn't particularly bad. It was right there in the middle. By 2020 or 2019, on the eve of the pandemic, it had just left the herd altogether. And this is just a gradual failure to keep up with the improvements in life expectancy that were happening in other countries. You can also see that America did really badly during the pandemic, a much bigger hit than nearly all of the other rich countries. So this is another picture which divides the US population into those who have a four-year college degree and those without a four-year college degree. And this is life expectancy at age 25, because you don't know before age 25 whether they're going to have a college degree or not. And what you can see here is this remarkable thing that since after 2010, life expectancy stopped rising and has been falling all but 1 year for people without a four-year college degree. That's 2/3 of the population. This is not a minority, it's a majority of Americans. And during that period, albeit at a slower rate, life expectancy for men and women with a four-year college degree continued to rise. You can also see during the pandemic, both groups lost life expectancy, but the loss in life expectancy was vastly larger for those without a four-year degree. Now, if you superimpose that on the picture I showed you before, so this is now adult life expectancy for the 22 other rich countries, and you can see the terrible things that happen in the US and the divergence of it with these other countries, all to do for people without a BA. And if you look at the people who do have a BA, these people up here, they're close to Switzerland or Japan, and they're doing just fine. They're doing as well as the best countries in Europe, whereas it's the people on the bottom who are just falling off the end of the world. So what's happening to them, and what does it have to do with economic policy? And I've talked about trade. I've talked to that harm is mostly due to workers without a BA. Economists say, okay, but winners can afford to compensate losers, except that they don't. And money is not all that counts. Even the unions don't want the compensation. They refer to the compensation as burial insurance. They want their jobs, they want their communities. There's been this amazing triumph of oligarchy in modern America as echoes of the gold gilded age. Consumer price standards and antitrust privileges consumers over producers. Sometimes that's okay, but consumption is not the only thing that matters. And business interests have become much more dominant in the legal system. And then this huge decline in unionization and concomitant decline in political power through wages, through working conditions, and through social conditions. Unions used to be very powerful, both locally in the states, in your town, in the states, and in the federal government. Now the total lobbying effort of the unions, all unions in the US, is less than about one large company like Alphabet or Facebook or Meta, whatever it's called. So that unions who brought power to working people essentially no longer exist. There are only about 6% of private sector workers who are unionized. Power is another word that economists don't talk about very much, and they ought to. They need to do more so. And family formation depends on these good jobs, many of which have been lost. And in my book, Deaths of Despair, we argue a lot of this is due to an exorbitantly expensive healthcare system, which is financed through what is essentially a flat tax on workers, which is just a catastrophe. So the decline in marriage has continued for those without a BA, so has out of wedlock childbearing, serial cohabitation, the changing social standards about sex outside marriage and the contraceptive pill have brought great benefits for educated or college-bound women, which Claudia Golden has described and for which she just won the Nobel Prize, but they've been catastrophic for working class women. I don't have time to talk about that, but I'd be happy to talk about it in questions. Something bad has happened here. Nope, there we go. And there have been large increases in pain and loneliness. So this decline in life expectancy is not just death, which it is, but there's a huge increase in pain and in morbidity going on too. So here's my final slide, which is, trying to think a little bit about what economics is about. And one definition that many economists, I think, would still accept is Lionel Robbins' definition, which is economics is about the allocation of scarce resources among competing ends. And that, I think, is the dominant description for most economists today. It's about efficiency. And markets and prices do this very well. And economists have come to trust in markets, even though there's some things markets cannot do. It gave us the financial crisis, and so on, and who gets what is irrelevant. But Amartya Sen, for one, has pointed out that's not the only way in which you can think about what economists ought to be doing. Here's Hayek, who you would have thought of, who's taken to be one of the apostles of neoliberalism, and this wonderful quote: "No one can be a great economist who is only an economist. Indeed, he's likely to become a nuisance, if not a positive danger. Economics ought to be broader than just economics and efficiency. It ought to be about other things too." Here's Arthur Cecil Pigou, who said it is not wonder, but rather the social enthusiasm which revolts from the sordidness of mean streets and joylessness of withered lives that is the beginnings of economic science. So that economics should be much more about relieving these horrors of mean streets and joylessness. And then finally, this quote of Keynes, which is not as widely known as it ought to be. He said, "The political problem of mankind is how to combine three things: economic efficiency, social justice, and individual liberty. And we're typically rather good at doing maybe two of those or one of those, but not doing all three together. They may not be compatible, but it's something that I think we need to think about." Thank you very much. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much for that overview and introduction to today's discussion. And before I turn it over to Christoph and you, Angus, the question we introduce here is how this ties together with the, again, rise of Donald Trump in the polls right now. And he's almost sure to become the candidate for the Republican Party. And I don't have to elaborate what that might mean for the election in the fall. So how would you, to kick it off, how would you tie your views and perspective on economists and their role in creating the circumstances of the rise of Donald Trump, maybe in 2016, but also more urgently in 2024?
Well, I think the policies that we as members of the governing elite, which economists certainly are, prioritized an efficiency that didn't take much account of what was happening to working class Americans. I think we condescended to them. So if they said, we don't agree with these policies, we said, that's because you're stupid, or maybe because you're a racist. And we said, well, you know, you should let these things happen and we'll compensate you, except we never did. And, you know, in a democracy, ignoring two-thirds of the wishes of two-thirds of the population is a pretty stupid thing to do. And, you know, even if we were right, you don't have to take an economics exam in order to be allowed to vote. And the trouble is that I'm not sure we were always right. So we were certainly very arrogant. And, you know, if you look at the people who vote for Donald Trump, it's a working class versus, you know, it's exactly the same divide I've been showing you in these life expectancy figures. And what is interesting is that's even happening across race now too. So increasing number of less educated African Americans and Hispanics are voting for Donald Trump too, because they don't like being condescended to or maltreated either. They want a part in the way the country is run.
So, Christoph, what would be your take coming from the outside? Because I mean, I've been living in New York for 20 years. I still feel that people living long enough in the United States get a little tainted, I guess. So, what is your take on what are you seeing from the outside in?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for allowing me, giving me the privilege of adding some comments to Angus's introduction and in Angus's talk. There's actually sometimes, if you know an author really well, you hear him while reading the book. You don't need the audible edition, and I think that's exactly what happened to me when I was reading the book. And especially in the beginnings, in this first part of the book, that resonates well with my own experiences. Actually, I didn't realize so clearly that when I started out for the nearly 4 years in the United States, 87 to 91, that was just a few years after you started out there. That wasn't really that well. And if I may say, we were all so young at the time. So that's an impression that I got away with by reading. I had a lot of fun reading, actually, and some of those I remember also already sharing with. That's really a privilege. I very much share the feeling that is running through the book, and that Angus expressed also in the beginning, the feeling of ambivalence, the high respect for the tremendous academic, cultural, economic achievements of the United States, and at the same time being so maybe drastically saying appalled by the large tolerance for extreme inequality and abject poverty. That's something I had a difficult time living with, and our own decision to return from the United States to Germany was in part triggered, or not triggered, was caused by this feeling of not really feeling well in this society too well. Despite all the tremendous impressions and the tremendous atmosphere that was shared in a place like Princeton, which is really something very special. I think that the little attention, or too little attention, to that people in the political sphere pay to all groups of society, especially those groups that don't have a large voice in the US, maybe because of income reasons. In our country, not so much, because we have ourselves such a good tax and transfer system, such a well-functioning one. But still, we have similar problems that some groups of society, Angus was talking about pitchforks, which resonates with our latest experiences on the streets. But we have similar problems. So not taking or not respecting the needs and preferences of all people in societies is coming back at you at some point. We don't really have the polarized discussion in economics as far as my impression is concerned. And we also don't have what you describe in the book as economistic. I mean, of course, we have people who have a primitive understanding of economics, but so few people in Germany take economics courses. You describe about 40%, I think, are in some way or another experiencing some basic introductory economics course. I wish that were the case in my country. And the blind faith in the proper functioning of markets, that's something in our political discussion is not really that present. But still, I mean, we, I think, share the same problem or the same fact of life. In my experience, I was often disappointed by the fact that economists are people like anybody else, opportunistic, many or often being opportunistic, and too chicken-hearted to challenge the mainstream. It's easier to run with the crowd than to speak your own mind. And I think in the context in which you are operating, that might mean to be a blind or to voice your blind faith in markets, or it might be also something different. In our country, it would be one thing that I would like to put into perspective from our point of view, from our perspective. We have such a huge skepticism of economics and of economists. I mean, if you want a very primitive anecdotal evidence, watch a German crime show. You immediately spot the villain. It's the guy from a pharmaceutical industry. It's the guy who is a real estate agent. So it's really easy to spot whom the German society usually doesn't really cherish too much or appreciate too much. I think that we, in fact, pay too little attention often in our quest for something that we cherish a lot in our society, namely social justice and equality or reducing inequality, efficiency. Take climate policy as an example. I think I stopped with the climate policy because we can talk about this a long time, but I've been advocating using carbon pricing for quite some years, and it's really a difficult sell because concerns are so high that the inequity or the distribution effects are so large, as if other measures wouldn't have any distribution effects. So I'd rather like to have more economic knowledge sometimes in the German populace at large. Finally, I'd like to advocate one thing. I think that what I learned also, especially in Princeton and from people like Angus and from David Card, is empirical evidence should be at the heart of our analysis and of our recommendations and positions. And it should always pay reference to the context of things. I think that's very important. Policy advice without deep understanding or respect for institutional setups is on a slippery slope. And I think if you are in for a balanced view, learning a lot about America and about economists in America, but also being clear that we need more perspective on historical, societal, institutional context, then you are right with this book. And it's really a pleasure that I could comment on this. Thank you.
I wanted to thank you so much, Christoph, for basically taking the view from across the pond. What I found really interesting is that the focus is almost exclusively now on the monetary aspects of the economy, inequality, income, you name it, because it's kind of measurable. Whereas what makes people really tick in life is not so measurable, or at least we haven't done a great job measuring, like Angus pointed out, pain, for instance, or loneliness, which is an increasing problem in our society, and the lack of cohesion, which makes everything else really hard to do. I mean, all the kind of great solutions we have, if you don't have solidarity or cohesion in your society, it's really basically very hard to introduce. So is that something that kind of looking forward from your book, that economists should be more mindful of, or kind of looking into making more progress into measuring or making these things more applicable in real life and policy making?
Thank you, Christoph, and thank you, Heike, too. This is really, really useful already. I've learned a couple of things that I hadn't thought of, and it seemed to me very valuable. First of all, there's a certain amount of banging going on in the background, and I will try to minimize its effects, but I'll talk loudly. One of the things that I've been thinking about well-functioning welfare state, one of the things that Anne and I have been very struck by is you don't have deaths of despair in Europe to anything like the same extent you have them. There's some in the English-speaking countries, and in my home country of Scotland, they're almost as bad as they are in the United States, amazingly. One of the reasons we've always thought about from the beginning, and people on the left have always pushed us in that direction, is that you have well-functioning welfare states. And to a first-order approximation, the difference is Europe is value-added tax. We do not, and that value-added tax is about enough to fund a well-functioning welfare state. So the question is, why does the welfare state not rule out the populism? And that's an open and I think very important question. I think part of it is condescension, and it's one of the arguments there's always been for universal basic income, which I'm not in favor of, but nevertheless, the thing about a universal basic income is it provides solidarity. Everybody gets it, and it's absolutely part of your citizenship. And you don't have to deal with the welfare bureaucracy, which may be demeaning in various ways and which may stigmatize the poor. So that's always been a potential problem with that. And I think, that's been better documented, very well documented in Britain in a number of movies and so on, about the failings of the welfare state. And, I don't know what you do about that. You certainly don't want to abolish it. On the other hand, administering this is genuinely very hard. I had also not thought of the point that Christoph made about how you do not have 40% of young Germans taking Economics 101. And what's more is that's a very simple-minded Economics 101. I mean, if you read Greg Mankiw's book, which, he was the right-wing advisor to a right-wing president, and that's what the 40% of Americans are being taught. And they get very angry about it, I think. And there are attempts to repair that. I mean, there's this project in London, which is providing free textbooks online of a very different flavor. I wish there were more attention in America to rent seeking, which it sounds like in Germany people do pick up on it and identify these corporate buildings as trying to use the government. A big difference with Europe, which my friend Thomas Philippon has argued, is that lobbying here is easier because you have the government at hand, whereas in Europe, lobbying is a little harder because it's easy to lobby your nation state than it is to lobby the EU, for example. So that one of the advantages of the EU, many disadvantages too, is that lobbying is harder. It's certainly not impossible by any manner of means. So just so that this doesn't become a total love session, I really do wonder about the carbon pricing. And that's something I think economists have probably been wrong about. I'm not so sure about it. That's one of the things I didn't talk about along with immigration, where I think economists were by and large wrong too. The thing about carbon pricing is you say, okay, this will have very negative distribution effects, but we can fix those in other ways. It's actually remarkably hard to fix them in other ways without actually canceling out the effect you want in the first place. So, I mean, if you want to leave people unharmed, you have to basically give them back the money they were spending before, and then you remove the incentive to do it. Now, obviously, one could do better than the attempt that was made in France, where there was no attempt to compensate at all. But I do suspect that we have to think of other ways of doing that. And the Biden-type policies there are probably likely to be more successful because they don't penalize people. They give people incentives to do more positive things. And I'm rather in favor of that, though I don't feel very strongly about it. And I was just trying to find something to disagree with Christoph with, only a little bit. And then just at the end about the measurability, I have a very strong thing to say there, which is health is measurable and mortality is measurable. It's not very hard to tell whether people are alive or dead. It's sort of hard to tell whether they're in pain or in how much pain, but we can make pretty good progress on that. But you can certainly measure their mortality rates. And what strikes me as amazing is these amazing graphs I've shown you, which are our graphs, but they've been widely circulated. I mean, the Economists made that second graph, the graph of the day one day. The New York Times has published these. There's been a huge amount of publicity around these things. And yet the government takes no responsibility whatsoever for those numbers, right? So in the post-war settlement, there was a sort of agreement somehow that governments would take responsibility for macroeconomic policy, for inflation and for unemployment. There's no one in government who's taking responsibility for these mortality numbers. They don't even seem very interested in them. And one of the things that drives me nuts is this current narrative we're reading all the time about how America is so successful and Europe's a basket case, and Britain's economy is contracting. The EU is not doing very well, and America is firing on all cylinders. And no one ever mentions the fact that these bodies are piling up in the street. And that's a real problem. And it comes from this very narrow focus on, economic things. So that's what I thought of listening to you guys. So thank you very much.
So
if I may say something to the carbon pricing.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
We have such a highly regulated market for energy that there are some issues that you can deal with, like the high taxes on the net, the high fees on electricity grid, and so on. You could use the carbon price revenue easily to reduce on electricity prices, on the surcharges paid for providing the grid and so on, and thereby make using electricity even more attractive than by that emphasizing the change to renewable energies. So there's a lot of possibility in theory, but it's very difficult to convince policymakers and the public that something that you can see is the price. You pay the price at the pump, for example, for your gasoline, but it's difficult to make it clear that the reduction in energy costs and electricity costs is coming as a compensation mechanism. So I agree, it's not easy, but I think it's better than you might be thinking in the moment. And it's more possibilities in Germany, at least, or in Europe.
So we got a couple of questions that I wanted to run by you. We can't really take all of them up, but I just felt that maybe one or two would be really get some word from the audience in. So there's one about left-wing policies that the audience member felt that would be a likely or logical answer to support the working class. But the question is why is the working class drifting to the right, not only in the US, but also in Europe? And he asks, does this represent a demand for cultural conservative but economical left political representation with the promise of stability? And yes, that would be one of my questions as well. Is insecurity more to blame than inequality?
Well, I'm not pushing inequality. I mean, I think the big inequality that I'm most concerned with is not income inequality, but the differential treatment of people in America who have a four-year college degree and those who don't. And this educated elite, who are the big beneficiaries of globalization, versus the people on the other side who've lost their jobs and lost many of their communities. The question about left-wing policies, I'm not sure we've ever really tried them. You get administrations, but the Democratic administrations under Clinton and under Obama were basically run for Wall Street. And, they appointed, secretaries of the Treasury and main advisors, economic advisors, who were drawn from Wall Street. So, when they were in power, they governed like Wall Street. Whereas when the Republicans were in power, they governed like Wall Street too. So the populism seems like someone's listening to me sort of idea. And I don't think they've had much opportunity other than, at least until Biden came along. And I think Biden is really genuinely trying to do things differently. And, a lot of these industrial programs, the place-based programs, they attempt to do green things through incentives rather than through prices. If I'm very hopeful about that, if it gets to run long enough. And of course, as your commenters know, that if you bring Trump back to power, what we've currently got is this alliance between populism on the one hand and the business community on the right, who's funding the Republican Party. I have no idea how long that's going to be stable, because the business executives are not necessarily on board with all of that stuff, but in some sense that they'll take it if they get paid enough. I mean, Jamie Dimon said at Davos that they could live with Trump. Well, meaning give us the money and we don't like the man and we think he's disgusting, but we care about money more than not having Trump as president. So, I mean, I think that's what's happening. We haven't really tried this sort of left-wing policies, the industrial policies, the tariffs, the trade policies, or treated immigration seriously. That really bothers people. Economists keep telling people it doesn't lower wages. I think the economists are probably wrong. And, the historians have some very good evidence. There's also this wonderful, I don't know if your audience have seen these graphs, but there's the famous Piketty-Sayers graph that shows, inequality in 1900 being incredibly high, and then it's dripped, and then it's gone back up to where it was. There's another graph that looks exactly like that, which is the fraction of people in the US who were born outside of the US. And a lot of us think those have something to do with one another, and that, the support of businesses for unskilled immigration is just very, very strong. And they benefited from it, and American workers, I think, lose. And the Democrats have said, you're racist or you're stupid, and the economists say our differences in difference estimators and all our regression things show that immigration doesn't hurt wages. And I think that's just wrong.
Christoph, I would really like you to kind of pick up that topic again, because immigration or migration is the topic that is driving the drift of Germany to the right. And it can't be all kind of economic backlash or anything like this. I guess it has to do with insecurity also, and not only in the monetary sense, but kind of perspectives or life kind of, basically the stability that people expect to have.
Yeah, I think that you're right, that it's not about economic stability. It's something that is difficult to grasp, but people are, let's say, concerned about what happens in the future with their communities, whether their finances, the public finances are still working and so on. But it's less about their own income or their own jobs. I don't think that's really an economic issue so much as a societal or cultural issue. We have, as economists, I agree with Angus, we have talked a lot about migration to Germany, immigration to Germany. We argue typically, I think most of us are arguing that due to demographic change that is coming about when the baby boomers such as myself are retiring, we will have a huge decline in the workforce, and we need immigrant workforces and a larger immigration to partially compensate for this on top of automation and so on. That's easy to say for a cosmopolitan researcher who is using his liberty to be anywhere in the world discussing with like-minded people. But it's difficult to accept this tremendous change to our society within a short period of time. And of course, we have been an immigration country for decades. Many people come, many of them stay for a long time and work here, and they have children here and so on. So we are an immigration country by rational argument, but to say that on a rational basis and to convince people who are not in this intellectual discussion, insiders into this intellectual discussions are two different things. And I think you are correct that the problem that we have in the moment with the right-wing uprise, with the populist uprise, has a lot to do with the immigration and how it has been handled. What Angus perhaps cannot know is that those people who get asylum rights in Germany are treated as German citizens in terms of their eligibility for welfare payments. And that makes people at least concerned whether that's really something that can be sustained.
I just wanted to say that if you talk about immigration, and you talk about the need, the aging of the population, we need more people, and the labor force is falling otherwise. Every time you say that, you should mention wages. And people don't. They say, GDP would not increase without these immigrants. Well, maybe GDP would increase, but natives would get higher wages. So, there's a supply and demand issue here. And it's not that I disagree with the fact that, we need more migrants, we need to handle it in a good way. But, statements that say we need more workers and therefore we need more migrants without talking about the wage rates is, just ignoring even the Economics 101.
Yeah, but there's a second step to it, namely the companies have to invest in Germany in their new factories, in the renovation of their factories, in opening new sites and so on. And typically the really big industrial players are internationally mobile. So if we don't have a workforce here that is the reservoir that they can tap on, they will go somewhere else. And the high wages that we have in the first stage will just disappear. I think it's a little bit more a dynamic issue than just Economics 101.
I have no problem with that. It's just, you mentioned wages several times.
Yeah, sure.
Often don't hear it mentioned.
Okay.
I think, Thomas, you wanted to ask a question and jump in.
Yes, thanks. Angus, I just would like to know at the end of this excellent session, you described a lot of examples where economists and mainstream economists weren't right or did stick to some thinking or models that weren't correct, and it's quite convincing if it's on minimum wage or free trade or whatever these topics are, which have developed and where it became clear that reality doesn't fit quite well to the original models. Why is it? And I mean, what would you say how to make economists more efficient in that way?
Well, I mean, one of the things I'm not going to say, which increasingly bitter debates in economics, one of them end by people accusing each other of being corrupt. And they say, well, you only say that because you were paid off or because you got a huge bonus from Wall Street for saying that. I think it's true, though, that we were doing very well out of this system, for sure. And I think, the financial crisis was incredibly important because we had not anticipated it at all. And we really thought that letting deregulation flower would produce more GDP, which would benefit everybody. And that did not happen. And I think the financial crisis really exposed that as the scam that it had been all along. But it was not a scam for us. We were doing okay. But it just wasn't spreading. It wasn't trickling down, if you like, to the majority of the population. And I think, if people say, well, economics is fine, what we've been saying all along, what's in the textbooks is just fine, I'm going to say, well, it wasn't fine. Look at those mortality graphs. over the last 50 years. And, you know, look at real wages for people without a 4-year BA. Look at the premium that you get for having been to college in earnings, which is now over 100%. You know, there's just, we've built an economy that was very good for us, but it's not good for the majority of Americans.
There is one question coming from the audience again that ties right into Thomas's approach. So the question is, how would you describe the ability and willingness of today's economists to use big data compared to the methods and best practices used in the private sector, for example, insurance? So yeah, would you feel that maybe that was one of the recurring topics in your book too, right? That economists were clinging to models and whatever they had in theory instead of kind of saying, okay, let's look what's out there.
Yeah, I mean, the big data is an interesting thing. I mean, I think economists were among the first to analyze big data on a large scale. But, you know, the work, I'll come back to the main point, but the work that Anne and I did on education versus non-education, that's not published data. So you have to download 40 million death certificates and handle them one by one to discover the patterns I showed you there for people with and without a 4-year BA. It's not true that we're the only people who can do that anymore. What stunned me when we published that stuff first was the New York Times replicated that within a day or two. So there is this database journalism and so on, and big companies are doing it all the time. I mean, you know, the whole of Silicon Valley is based on the analysis of large-scale data. So there's no shortage of that in insurance companies and whatever. But I'm a bit worried that we've done something else, and this may be the topic of my next book. I think our econometric techniques have really seriously failed us because, you know, there's this thing in economics called the credibility revolution, in which we were not doing things right before, and now we use big data, we use randomized controlled trials, we use all sorts of other design-based econometrics to try and get these very credible answers. And we do get very credible answers, but we get them only about very small things. They're almost all local. And so you find something that is not clearly applicable outside of its sphere of reference or where it was first achieved. And I think that's a big problem. And you know, when I study history and I read a lot of history, historians are much better at this than we are. They recognize that causality flows in multiple directions, that there's a lot of contingency and all the rest of it. And economics, I think, has sort of lost that. And I think we're getting very precise answers, but those very precise answers are wrong when they're applied to the problems that we need to apply them to. So maybe when I write that up properly, it will not sound quite as strong and aggressive as that. But I do think there's been a real problem with economic practice that way. I mean, and it's true that what we were doing before wasn't very good either. Anyway, enough.
So, Christoph, what you were laughing. So, what is your take on going back to the reality and going back to the sources?
No, it's exactly describing my feelings, actually, because we are really called upon when we are entering a question or realm of questions without any precedent. It's easy to answer a question where you have many precedents that you can draw an analogy from. But if you can't, it's really something like an art to get it right. And I think that the Hayek quote was, for example, very telling. It's not enough to just know about economics and econometrics. You have to understand a little bit more about history, about societal change and so on. And so that's why I was laughing, because it was really resonating my own feelings so much.
I prefer you laughing to you groaning. Anyway, but I think too, you know, if you go back to what economics used to be, if you go back to Adam Smith, if you go back to that whole history, you know, Marx and John Stuart Mill and Ricardo, and even as late as Keynes and Friedman, those people were philosophers too. They really believed in philosophy. And, you know, economics has become very narrow compared with the breadth that you get in Adam Smith, and even in Milton Friedman. I mean, Milton Friedman was a libertarian. I don't agree with his philosophy, but he certainly was interested in and pulled away from the intensely mathematical economics in which he'd been trained in, and got into a big fight with Cole's mathematicians, that mathematical economists that we revere as our heroes today. So there was a sense in Friedman that, and as well as in Keynes, that there was a much broader basis for thinking about economics than the place we've got ourselves to today. And I think we have to reclaim that territory and build sort of ethical understandings of what we're doing, because these people are dying in the streets and we don't seem to care about it because we're happy about GDP.
So that sounds almost like we're coming to a head or to an end. So what you would be advocating is not an end to economists, but opening it up and making them, more kind of like a Renaissance men and women, in to kind of make a comparison to times when there were no economists. So one of the last questions that I wanted to ask you, you mentioned in your book repeatedly that the kind of problem that economists and the whole kind of profession had, that there was an utter lack of diversity. Do you think that we're overcoming that, and that might be partly a solution to what ails the profession?
Yes, I don't think we have to become Renaissance men and women. That's sort of tough. But we could think more about philosophy. Also, philosophers need economists, and that break has been bad for them too, I think. And we should have people read history, and But on the diversity and the openness, yes and no. One of the great things about economics is that, as I said at the very beginning, it's very open. So young people with new ideas can succeed very rapidly. And that's one of the things we should hold up. That's one of the really good things about America, that talent is recognized very early, and you don't have to be someone's servant for 20 years before you get promoted or whatever. So we're very good at that. On the other hand, the diversity within economics, I think, is not very satisfactory. I was reading the other day a piece by Anna Stansbury in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, and more than any other discipline, the people who get PhDs in economics are very, very unlikely to have a parent who didn't go to college. And that's more so, their parents, have PhDs, and that's more so than in any other PhD granting subject. And it's even true for foreigners, people like Christoph, who come and get PhDs in the US, that their parents are much more likely to be very highly qualified. And so at the very least, that's a loss of perspective. These people have not come from working class backgrounds in which they view the world differently. And I've often argued that the large number of non-Americans who get PhDs in the US is actually very helpful, because it's helping diversify the range of opinions and so on. But if they just look like us too, that's not helping very much. And I don't know how we overcome that.
Christoph, what is your perspective on that from the German perspective? Is there more diversity here in economics?
No, I don't think so. I think that we have our own problems of educational background or family background of highly educated people. The son and the father are often very much in the same realm of educational achievement as mother and daughter too. I think that's something to be overcome. My own thoughts went into another direction before, namely into this idea of working more between disciplines. As a young man, I was really not really very appreciative of interdisciplinary research, and I'm very much fond of it now. I'm working together on the German energy transition, with people from the natural sciences, engineering, and other social sciences. And it's really very rewarding, and we have something to bring to the table. I think that's very important. As an economist, you can be proud of some of the things that we do. And I think that's also part of Angus's message, that we have something to say. Incentives matter, budget restrictions are a thing of life, and people build expectations. Simple things like that are very important, and we can bring them to discussions that are including philosophers, ethicists, law specialists, and so on, in order to then form something together that makes for better policy. I think that's the way to go, but it's probably the remark of an elderly researcher too.
Yeah, well, part of the problem about non-diversity is that, you know, we're not just the elite, we're the children of the elite. And if you have a society that's redistributing upwards a lot of the time, that's a problem, because we're not going to fix it. Anyway, thank you.
So thank you so much. So what would be your takeaway for the next couple of months? How should we despair already, or is there still hope that the election in the fall might have a surprising upside?
I think there's hope, but I'm probably more pessimistic than I've been for a long time. In 2013, I wrote a book called The Great Escape, which was arguing that it was a very optimistic book about the progress of mankind over the last 250 years. And I just wrote a new preface for a new edition, or not a new edition, a reprint. And I think you could argue, I mean, the climate change was not there when I wrote it in 2013, or it was not as pressing as it was now. And this populist threat was really not there at all. I'm still pretty optimistic. And also, if you look back over even the 20th century, it had its share of catastrophes, to put it mildly. So, you know, you can't tell a totally Whig history of mankind, which there was steady progress. That's not what happened. But we always came through and picked up again. I think this time there's some chance we may not, but I'm still think we will. So maybe that's a good positive note.
Well, we'll take any positive note that we can get, I guess, at this point. So thank you so much for Christoph and Angus to kind of share your thoughts with us. And even if we're not kind of coming out of this discussion with kind of a set of plans or ideas how to fix all this, but at least I think if more discussion would happen, there might be even more hope. So let's see that this is the positive note for today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I just want to thank
you
for the moderation, and indeed we will follow up on all these issues in the next couple of months. And especially there's not only an issue with populism in the US, but also in Germany. So we have a need to better understand and to react properly. Thanks, Angus, Christoph Schmidt, and Heike Buchter, and see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the chance to talk to so many people. Okay, bye-bye.